As the people of Gaza face agonising death from orchestrated starvation, the EU is so concerned about the humanitarian situation that some of its member states cut the UNRWA funding and increase arms to Israel. The US is so troubled it's building a pier and airdropping food, but there's hundreds of trucks already at the border crossing full of supplies. It's just they're being prevented from crossing by the same Israel that the US is sending another $17.6 billion in military assistance to. What sort of sick monsters are these?
Ursula von der Leyen says she's planning on a Commissioner for Defence if she's in power next term. A Commissioner for Defence means a Commissioner for War. Why don't we have a Commissioner for Peace? What started as an economic union is fast developing into a military union. Great news for the elites that profit from war, but not good news for the citizens of Europe who see more and more of their money going to the military-industrial complex. Why in 2 years did we never work for peace in Ukraine? Why did Commissioner von der Leyen go to Tel Aviv to greenlight an Israeli genocide? Now the EU is supporting a genocide. We are still supporting a Zionist settler colonial project. The EU response to Israel's act of genocide in Gaza exposes all the talk about human rights, international law, and it all sounding meaningless. Each day there's a new atrocity, continual bombing and ethnic cleansing, the blocking of aid, and now starvation has been used as a weapon of war. The EU has been exposed.
Thanks, President. We watch in horror the live-stream genocide in Gaza. We see aid deliberately obstructed to a starving people. Meanwhile, the Maasai people are deported from their ancestral lands in Ngoro. Women and children shot if they refuse to leave. Hundreds dying in recent months of a lack of blood products and basic health care. They need 9,000 bags of maize to ensure their basic survival. The Sahrawi people are also exiled from their land, their valuable resources robbed by Morocco, with whom we do business, while 77% of their people depend on World Food Programme baskets and they only receive 10% of the funding that they need. These are humanitarian crises which need a humanitarian response, but they're not unavoidable tragedies. They are the consequence of human actions, of settler colonial projects and efforts to drive people off their lands. And the EU, which should be intervening to uphold diplomatic efforts and international law, is dripping in the blood of Israeli genocide and has no credibility whatsoever. EU sanctions. When they're not backfiring against ordinary Europeans, they're firing on all cylinders against ordinary people in the global south. By overwhelming majorities, the United Nations General Assembly and the UN Human Rights Council have over the years again and again and again and again condemned the kinds of unilateral sanctions that the EU and US apply against poorer countries. They've said that they disproportionately harm the most vulnerable. They've said that they undermine people's human rights. Again and again, they've called on the West to stop adopting and implementing them. And here we are, not only ignoring this global condemnation, but going further and criminalising those who dare to fail to comply with them in the first place. Meanwhile, we refuse to impose a sanction that we're legally obligated to impose, that of an arms embargo on Israel. This, friends, is the rules-based international order. 60% of people worldwide who rely on humanitarian aid are in countries under sanction. Most need aid because of the sanctions. Sanctions are weapons of war. In the global south, they starve and they destroy, and they most always never achieve what they're supposed to do. The definition of madness is repeating the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. But we know when it comes to human rights, the EU lost its mind quite some time ago.
When it was founded in 2002, the European Maritime Safety Agency had a narrow focus on the monitoring of ship movements. But its role has expanded into areas such as Coast Guard operations and the surveillance of migration flows. The agency is increasingly complicit in the militarisation and externalisation of the EU's border policies. From 2018 to 2020, the Maritime Agency leased drones through a Portuguese company that were manufactured by Israel's largest military company, Elbit Systems. That contract was worth €59 million. Israel developed and battle-tested these drones in Gaza in its brutal and inhumane treatment of Palestinians. Border security is a central part of the European Security Research Programme, and the Commission has used this programme consistently in order to support the development of a competitive European security industry. This has allowed military technology to be systematically transferred to border management. The defence industry is making a fortune while we allow migrants drown at sea.
Thanks very much, President. This is the first EU legislation regarding spyware, and as it stands, unless our amendments are accepted, we are legislating to authorise its use against journalists. The great EU that defends media freedom, that flies the flag of democracy against authoritarianism, is authorising the unleashing of spyware against journalists. We already know it's been used against journalists and politicians. We know it's not possible to regulate it. It's so destructive, it's classified as a weapon and subject to arms control restrictions. We don't talk about abuse of chemical weapons or cluster bombs. We recognise it's their use that's the problem, and we ban them outright. And it has to be so regarding spyware. This technology takes over your device without your knowledge. It surveils your whole life and everyone who comes into contact with you. It's abhorrent in any state that claims to be democratic. It was pioneered by Israel, tested on Palestinians like all other Israeli weapons. It should be banned.
The final draft of the European Media Freedom Act is disappointing, but no surprise given how the EU is hell-bent on promoting the defence industry at every opportunity. This legislation could have made a strong statement that the use of spyware by member states against journalists would be illegal. Instead, it fudged the issue. And the legislation now refers to the fact that the European Union confirms to respect member states' responsibilities with regard to national security. The consequence of this is that the Council's retention of the national security exemption enables EU governments to continue to deploy spyware against journalists under the guise of national security outside the protective framework of EU law. This is a backward step at a time when we know that spyware programmes such as Pegasus and Predator have been employed by EU governments. Neither should we forget that many of these Israeli companies who make a lot of this stuff test our products on Palestinians under illegal occupation. And I wonder, this European Media Freedom Act, will it do anything for the freedom of journalist Julian Assange? We have a regulation to extend the trade liberalisation measures for Ukraine's agricultural products in the same session as we have a call to impose sanctions on Russian and Belarusian food and agri-products to the EU. The EU's grain prices have been primarily depressed by the influx of cheap Ukrainian grain. The EU wants to support Ukraine during the war effort, but the reality is Ukraine's agri-exporters are offshoring billions of the profits from sales in the EU, while EU farmers see their costs rise due to the war and the self-defeating sanctions, and their income threatened by cheap imports. Grain growers in Ireland are seeing their livelihoods eroded by cheap Ukrainian imports. Why put grain growers in Ireland out of business just to enrich big agri in Ukraine? The EU should stop supporting trade deals that benefit speculators and put an end to profiteering by hedge funds. More sanctions on Russia and Belarus will not solve the problems of our farmers. If you might try and stop the war, it might help.
Thank you, President. As the people of Gaza face agonising death from orchestrated starvation, the EU is so concerned about the humanitarian situation that some of its member states cut the UNRWA funding and increase arms to Israel. The US is so troubled it's building a pier and airdropping food, but there's hundreds of trucks already at the border crossing full of supplies. It's just they're being prevented from crossing by the same Israel that the US is sending another $17.6 billion in military assistance to. What sort of sick monsters are these? There would be no famine or genocide in Gaza if Biden restrained Israel. His support has been conscious and unconditional. So as the Irish politicians shamefully cross the Atlantic to doff the cap for Patrick's Day and pay homage to this butcher, they should remember that our history and relationship with the US comes from our famine. Irish Americans should know the people of Ireland stand against genocide, Joe. Shasamid leis an Palestine, Chucky.
We stand with Palestine. Our day will come.
This report takes time to condemn Hamas and Russia, but not a bad word about Israel. In fact, it says we should continue to build peace and stability in the region. What peace and stability? We can't even call for an unconditional ceasefire while EU member states funnel endless weapons and financial aid to a regime openly perpetrating a genocide. During Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza, the European Investment Bank has signed off on $650 million in loans for Israeli infrastructure projects. With over 12,000 children killed, we now have children starving to death in Gaza as Israel imposes famine conditions on 2.3 million Palestinians. And still, the right wing have the inhumanity to table an amendment calling for the suspension of funding to UNRWA. The EPP have tabled an amendment to make all EU funds to the Middle East and North Africa conditional on a declaration of a recognition of Israel, while brazenly conflating opposition to the genocidal settler colonial Zionist state of Israel with anti-Semitism. EU racism knows no bounds. Reading the Afghan resolution beside the Gaza one, it's hard to believe that the two were negotiated by the same parliament. The Taliban is condemned for their treatment of women and girls, and rightly so. The resolution says they are to be held accountable for their crimes. Sanctions must be imposed. Meanwhile, in the genocide of Gaza, only Hamas are condemned. The humanitarian has been blocked by Israel, but reading the text, you wouldn't know it. The Israelis are carrying out extrajudicial executions of men, women and children, but just won't talk about it. The Israelis are imposing famine conditions and using starvation as a weapon of war against 2.3 million civilians, but listening to ye, it's square as a natural disaster. We don't like the Taliban, but they're not killing tens of thousands of civilians, yet you're throwing the book at them. Well, you can't even bring yourselves to properly name the genocidal crimes of the Israeli regime. Is it because you're complicit in the war crimes of the Israelis? What is wrong with this place?
Thanks, President. This week's resolution on Afghanistan is a tour of force. It really is. Gaslighting, phony feminism, weaponised concern, all the greatest hits. 20 years of NATO war and occupation that visited suffering, death and destruction on the women of Afghanistan. According to this resolution, it never happened. The empowerment and consolidation of the Taliban from that war and occupation. Again, that never happened. A reflection on the fact that the US invaded Afghanistan to save Afghan women and that instead murdered and maimed them in their tens of thousands and then left, and the vast, vast majority of them worse off than they were before. Forget it. The very last thing Afghan women need is more Western concern, more of the iron fist concealed in a velvet glove, because until the West starts reckoning with the 23 years of violence and pain it's brought to the women of Afghanistan, then you'll never be in a position to effect change.
All artefacts, national treasures and all artwork stolen or plundered by countries throughout history should be returned, and Russia should return the Romanian national treasure. But in here, we seldom apply the same level of scrutiny to our own member states. Take France, for example. The French have engaged in two of the most worst cases of plundering of artwork in the last 500 years, firstly under Napoleon and secondly under the Vichy government. As of 2024, half of all the artwork stolen by Napoleon still remains in France. And God knows British museums are stuffed with stolen artefacts. Any chance that they might start returning it to the rightful owners. And in recent times, we've had money stolen from the Afghan Central Bank by the Americans and the Swiss and some UK banks. And any chance that they might return that because it is needed for humanitarian purposes in Afghanistan. And also, we've had UK banks who have stolen money from Venezuela. There's gold in London belonging to the Venezuelans, but the Brits have stolen it. Maybe the EU should put some pressure on everyone to return what they've stolen. There's a lot of thieves around. We talk a lot in the EU about human rights, EU values, defending democracy from the threat of authoritarianism. Meanwhile, the Commission President and right wing are doing deals with the likes of Tunisia to outsource the EU borders to repressive dictatorships. Hardly surprising given von der Leyen's support for the genocide in Gaza by the fascist Israeli regime. It seriously challenges EU claims to have anything to do with progress and humanity. For hundreds of years we have genocided and plundered, using our gains to enrich ourselves. We have strangled many independent movements with death traps and forced de-development through structural adjustment programmes. In North Africa and the Middle East, people flee NATO regime change wars and their fallout, climate change caused by the developed North, and the neoliberal impact of the IMF and the World Bank. And what do? We pay compradors to detain and kill the people looking for a better life than the one that we've helped to create for them.
Thanks yet again, President. I was really glad to see this motion tabled and I voted for it. It's past time for this Parliament to get serious about clipping the Commission's wings, because the Commission, and particularly its President, are out of control. And if you care about the rule of law, that should really bother you. It's not just that the Commission is going on mandate-free solo runs in relation to the Tunisia deal. We've also had Ursula von der Leyen without any mandate, undermining member state policy towards Europe's biggest trading partner, China, siding with her bosses in Washington over the heads of the European governments she's supposed to work with. We've had her flagrantly usurping member states' prerogatives in relation to foreign policy with her trip to Israel and her repeated declaration of Europe's unconditional support for that gang of genocidal maniacs. And in response from this slow-rolling coup, nothing. A few quiet words of concern behind the closed doors of the Council, not good enough. We have laws, we have treaties. When someone starts incinerating it, it should concern us all. Hopefully today's motion is a small signal that the Parliament is finally waking up to that.